Here are some ways in which the Logos, or the living Christ, can be found as an experience. As an introduction, you need to ask yourself, how do you know that the experience or the entity that you find is the Logos or the Christ? A couple of clues here. First of all, if the being gives you pleasure or bliss, that does not necessarily prove anything. But if, on the other hand, it takes away your pain, that could be a useful clue. You need to be sure that the entity is not some other being in disguise, or even pure illusion. And that is why I suggest, as you will see, that you practice more than one way, so that you build up your personal relationship with Christ on many levels, including through reading slowly and meditating and letting the Gospels come alive in you. You build up a more complete and precise knowledge of who the being that we call the Christ truly is. It is also very important that you need to be aware that every human being is totally powerless before fate. That fate is administered by Christ, and it is administered for our benefit. Which means that when we are faced with suffering and pain and sickness and even death, it is something that we need in order to grow. In sickness, we may need to go through the healing process so that new forces can be awakened in us and we emerge healed and refreshed. If you can remember how you felt, for example, after a flu, the first day that you were healthy again, you will know what I am talking about. Similarly, pain, above all emotional pain, can be something that is very positive in its effect upon us, though at the time it is very obviously something that any normal person would be very glad to do without. But the point is, we are work in progress. We can shape ourselves and collaborate with Christ in moving us towards the better being that we should be, and by doing that, change our viewpoints and make ourselves better. If we just remain as we were, in fact, we can only go rotten and go backwards. The other thing that we should be aware of is the promise that Christ made in the Gospels: seek and you shall find. This is something that is absolutely vital. You must continually seek for Christ. It is not something that you can ever stop, because once you have made contact, then the question then is to go into deeper and deeper and ever deeper contact. It never ends. Union with Christ, after all, is a path. It is not a state of do it once and forget it. You can't go just been there, done that. You have to continue, and it never ends. After all, think of this. Christ died for you. What are you willing to do in return? Think about it. There is the possibility of practicing real self-gift until you die. In other words, living for Christ, or living with Christ in ever greater union, to be his servant and to thus bring about what we ask for in the Lord's Prayer: His kingdom come. We become co-workers with Christ. That is what is necessary, because in the end, everything we have, everything we are, we have received from God. He has given it to us. He can just as easily take it away. So what have we got that we can give? The only thing that we really have is ourselves. So that is what we can give. There is also another essential question, which is, have you been baptized? Now, I am not one of those who believes that total immersion is a complete necessity. I believe that some form of baptism, however, is the gateway through which Christ enters our individuality. And confirmation, which is practiced by the Catholic Church and certain Protestant churches, is also very important, because it brings the effect of baptism to a more adult level. But these are considerations which are best dealt with personally and individually. So here is a quick summary of the ways to find the Logos that I will run through. First of all, and probably the most important one, is introspective search when suffering emotional pain. The second one is tremendously important in the light of thinking concentration, because this is the only way in which we as individuals can guarantee freely finding Christ by inward searching. This is the only method that actually depends upon our initiative and not upon something that comes from God himself. This can also happen via pure perception in non-physical communion, and also once this has been recognized, it can be seen in the light that shines at midnight on cloudy nights. That sounds like a paradox, but it is an inner reality. This is not physical light, it is spiritual light. Similarly, Christ can be found within every mouthful of food and drink. Once we understand what happened and why he drew our attention to it, what had happened, at Calvary, and why he drew the attention to it during the Last Supper, particularly in the speeches that are to be found at the back of the Gospel of John. Similarly, once the Christ has been recognized and the light that comes from the Spirit has been acknowledged, you can see it in the light that shines from the eyes, and I'll give you various examples of how you can find this, for example, in newborn babies. I also suggest very strongly that you take the initiative to practice slow gospel reading. That is, one verse per day, or even slower. The purpose being to build a gradual and complete image of Christ. This is the way in which you will be certain that what you are dealing with is the Christ, and not some deception, which is obviously the game played by the Antichrist, as detailed in the Apocalypse of the Mount of Olives, in the three Gospels, and so on. Similarly, the Logos can be found in disasters. This is what happened to St. Paul on the way to Damascus, when he was blinded by the Christ being. This is usually the last resort for people who Christ calls, who have ignored all other wake-up calls. This is something that is not to be desired, but it is a real possibility, and I suspect this is going to be happening more and more in the near future, particularly as people, for very many reasons, are ignoring any calls from their own hearts to the Spirit. This can also be seen in the heart of life, in ourself, and in all strangers. And again, I will run through that. And lastly, it is going to be the basis of your free state of self-giving as you act moving forward into the future. So now I go into the first one, which is introspective search in emotional pain. Now, most people who are suffering emotionally do not want to look inside. They are afraid, they are filled with fear of experiencing more pain. And above all, they do not want to know how they have caused, or they do not want to see their own guilt in the cause of the circumstances that gave rise to that emotional pain. But what I suggest, and this is in a way a demand to rise up beyond yourself in courage and examine what is going on inside you when you suffer. And here is a first question for you. When you look at the pain that you suffer, is the pain lessened just by the very fact of looking? If so, by what process? Or would it be more accurate to ask, by whom? And examine it further. How does this work? You can even ask yourself, just who is suffering? And the answer is not obvious. I'm not going to give it here. But it is possible for you to discover that there is somebody else in your most intimate being who takes upon himself your share of emotional suffering, which is more than you can presently stand. I suggest very strongly you rinse and repeat and repeat and repeat until you have found the Christ. There are positive aspects to pain. These must not be ignored, but they should be stressed, and these are one of the main reasons why you should look inside. Pain awakens us. Otherwise, we are deeply asleep in terms of what is going on around us and inside us. It enlivens us. It makes us feel alive. Certainly not a pleasant sensation, but it does enliven us. Also, it cleans us up inside. It is incredible the extent to which inner pain helps us to get rid of a whole load of guilt and a whole load of evil, because it fosters empathy. We cannot turn our backs upon a fellow human being who is suffering, because we know what it means. Pain has given us depth. Pain has given us understanding of what it is to be a human being alive. And it will also show us who our true friends are. They may be people that we already know. They may be people we have never met. But it shows us who is really on our side. And when you are aware of pain and can examine it, the way you can examine, for example, a glass to see if it is clean, you will see it develops courage, and it also develops selflessness. You do not want other people to go through this because you know what it feels like. But pain also contains some dangers, and you need to be aware of this, because those dangers lead to depression and despair, and depression and despair are situations where the Christ is locked out of our soul. And the danger of pain is, first of all, it can become addictive, in the sense that we feel that nobody around us has ever suffered, nobody understands us, and we become self-indulgently, how can I put it, self-indulgently active towards ourselves, saying, oh, poor us, nobody understands us. This is rubbish. But this is a form of addiction, and it is a form of self-indulgence, and it is not reality. Insight, which we do get through pain, can often be distorted, and that happens above all when we become cynical, when we start seeing people do not understand us because they cannot suffer. This is untrue. Everybody gets in a lifetime the pain that they can bear, and sometimes more than that. Nobody gets a free ride. Nobody comes through life unscathed. The question is, and the real test of our mettle, M-E-T-T-L-E, is that can we take it and come out clean, or do we become bitter and twisted? As I said before, pain can isolate us, and it can lead to fear and cowardice. But we must be aware that in each of these cases, this is our choice. It is up to us to take pain and become heroic, or it is up to us to simply become selfish cowards. What we choose will decide what our destiny becomes. And that is why it is important to be surrounded by people who understand, people who have suffered, people who are on our side. Concentration is a totally different issue. This is about as far removed from emotional pain as you can be. But this is the only certain method which will produce the desired result of contact with Christ. What is involved is this. For 5 minutes every day, you should concentrate on a simple man-made object, such as a glass, a nail, a chair, or, as I suggest, keep it really simple, a circle, and nothing else. This, first of all, gives you discipline, and it can, for a brief period while you carry out the exercise, give you some respite, particularly if you are in a situation when you are going through emotional storms. Then, once you have fixed that man-made object before your consciousness, which you have decided, it is your free choice, it is your thinking after all, nobody else's, and you decide to remove all of the sense aspects of the object which are relevant, which are, for example, with a circle, its shape, its color, how it was made, the sound it makes, does it make a sound? Its name, and so on. In other words, it becomes the simpler the object, the simpler the exercise. There is no point in doing this exercise on the internal combustion engine because it would take hours, or on anything as vague and nebulous such as Napoleon the Great. No, keep it simple. The purpose is to examine what is the thinking process through which we come to understand everything that is in the world around us, and how the process has been given to us. So then, when you've removed all of that, we contemplate what is left. When you are contemplating what is left, you cannot change it in any way, because if you do, the whole thing stops. It stops being concentration. The only thing you can do is follow the flow of thinking and observe the perspective in which you note the flow. Once you observe that, and you have, as it were, got a sufficient perspective inside on what's happening in your thinking, you will note that as the current inverts, the light is within you. At which point, here is a question. Where is the light in your individuality? This is important, because you must allow the light to illuminate and uplift you. Because that light, as you will find when you read the beginning of the Gospel of John, is what you have been looking for. I suggest you repeat this every day, at least over a period of 5 minutes, and I suggest no more than 30 minutes at a time, because otherwise you get terribly tired, you get stale, and the thing is, it just becomes too much. Choose an object in which you have no interest whatsoever, because you do not want to have something that has emotional ties. The purpose is to work with thinking alone, and out of that thinking to be as objective as is humanly possible, so as to get to the Christ in you. Pure perception is essentially the same exercise as concentration, but using a natural object which is placed before the senses. And I suggest, for example, either a crystal or a native metal, such as copper or a gold nugget if you have one, or you could use a living plant, or you could even use an animal, but I suggest it is best kept simple. A simple plant like grass works very well, and something that you know pretty well, so that you can imagine it as the plant grows from the seed to its flowering and back to seed again. And then the question is, once you have stripped away all sensory aspects, what is left? You will find there is an essence left over. And again, you have to contemplate it. But you can then experience inner communion. The Christ is what illuminates that inner communion as a natural Eucharist. Please see below, there will be a further reference on food and drink for the theology that explains this. Then there is the light of the midnight sun. Now, I suggest you do not start doing this until you've done the other two. This is an awareness which you can come to over time. It's not something that is immediate. That even in total darkness, there is always light. And light always shines above our heads. It's never below, even artificial light. It's always above our heads and works like a north point, a compass point for us. That light always shines in the darkness. And the darkness just simply cannot restrict it in any way. There is, even if you are in a building with curtains drawn in darkness at night, there is light that shines through the roof, that shines through the walls, that comes into us. And that midnight sun comes from within us. And that light is what made our eyes to see and to shine light. This is another way to find Christ. And I suggest you should have it shine in our hearts more and more, so that it gives us more and more enlightenment. Now, here we get to the food and drink. When Christ died at Calvary. His blood flowed down the cross and united with the earth. Now, the blood of the human being is the organ in which the individual I is most deeply linked. And that is why in the Old Testament the preparation of the bloodline was so important. And when that blood flow united with the earth, the being of Christ himself also united with the earth. Since then, the real individuality of Christ is present in every mouthful of food we eat, or every sip that we drink, because absolutely every food and every drink, they have all been in contact with the earth and infused with the individuality of Christ. Now, becoming aware of the sacredness of eating and drinking is something that can be tracked back using the same technique as in concentration to the Christ. And what this leads to is, in every meal, in every snack, in every drink, we become in a state of constant Christian communion with Christ, where Christ continually gives himself to us. The light in the eyes. By this point, the light of Christ is something that you should be able to recognize. And you will realize that it can shine from the eyes. In fact, the true purpose of us having eyes is not just to see our environment and the objects around us that we illuminate with thinking light so that we understand that the bowl-shaped object in front of us is an ashtray so that we can put our rubbish in it. But also, our eyes are made to shine. And by shining, we give out into the environment around us and into the lives of those around us a constant form of blessing, which does not come from us, but comes from the Christ within us. This is the case with newborns in the first 6 months of life, and anyone who has experience of newborn children will realize that what they bring into a household is a deep feeling of sacred peace for the first 6 months, until the eyes change color usually. Then we can find in the deep grace which is given to people who are in deep true love with each other, their eyes also shine, and for as long as they are capable of sustaining the state of love, which is something that can last for 1 day or 2, or a month or 2, or in certain exceptional cases even a whole lifetime, for as long as people are able to sustain that state of deep love, their eyes will shine. And their lives become a blessing, not just to the people around them, but to all of the environment around them. There are also certain people who live in a state of grace, which is a rare gift from God, and they are rare people. They have a state of blessedness where their fate, instead of like most people's, where it is a cycle of suffering and blessedness mixed together, so that we move forward between stick and carrot, between hammer and anvil, until we become as pure as diamonds hammered out of the carbon, the blackness of our initial sinful souls. These people go from success to success, and their eyes also shine, because they know nothing other than success. And it is true that anybody, if we have a momentary great achievement, for example, when we win the lottery with 100 million euros or something like that, our eyes shine, but it does not last. These blessed people have a continuing gift. Also, once you have lived a good life in the service of the Christ, once you pass the age of 70, which is an important point because life goes on, human life goes on in 7-year cycles. Certain people have the gift of being able to radiate light to those to whom they are able to tell the summary of the lessons that they have learned from their lives. It is important that people are able to listen to them, but very often, especially these days, youth has no interest in the life or the shining eyes of the elderly because nobody has told them to look for it. Also, I suggest that you read the Gospels extremely slowly to build a fuller, more living image of the Christ, and that will live in your heart as you go on. As I suggest you read the Gospel slowly, one verse at a time, and I suggest you spend a few minutes on each verse. This makes even the driest passages come alive, and certain of the passages are pretty dry, such as X begat Y. You think that is all that can be said about that person's whole life? That they gave rise to another being? Just think about it. What does it say about the peacefulness and the righteousness of a lifetime if that is the only comment that can be made about that person? It shows a state of extreme blessedness. And so there are other passages which some people find hard to understand. But if you go at it slowly, one verse at a time, and maybe compare translations, working less with ones that are determined with dogmatic intent, such as Catholic readings or Seventh-day Adventist readings of the Gospels. But if instead you look at a decent translation or compare translations, you will find that a living picture of Christ is formed, and that comes alive and lives in your heart, and that becomes a living yardstick for what your experience of Christ will be. It's slow, but it is certain. You can also experience Christ in disasters. Now, this is the way in which St. Paul received his knowledge of Christ. At the moment, this is not frequent, but I suspect it will become more so, just as it did to Christ. This is at present only given to those who have been called by Christ to become his disciples, but who have ignored the wake-up call time and again. When that happens, a disaster is brought about by God as a final warning. And if you do not start to seek Christ, there will be no inner meeting. Remember, the key is the expression, seek and you shall find. It is the seeking that is the important part, not the finding, because there is no point at which you have found enough. that continues forever. And often, in this case, this is the last resort, reserved for people who are superficial or have been superficial in their lives, for people who are overly busy, people who live as animals, simply assuaging their instincts and their pleasures, and anybody who sleeps inwardly in all kind of ways. I certainly hope this is not the way that you will come to your awakening. But even if it is, even if, like St. Paul, you are blinded for 3 days, you will know Christ directly. The heart of light. Once you recognize the light of Christ, and you then apply the exercise of pure perception on any person, and here I strongly recommend you use strangers rather than people who know you, because they can get terribly confused about what's going on and maybe think that you are intending something that you're not. You become aware that the light of Christ is present in everyone as a potential, and that anybody can be loved by us without limitation. This means Christianity is the completion, or rather the fulfillment, of all religions. Islam should become Christian Islam in the personage of the Mahdi. Hinduism should become Christian Hinduism in recognition that the Vishvakarman, or the ultimate God, is incarnate in Christ. Buddhism should become Christian Buddhism, recognizing that the Buddha Maitreya is the Christ. Taoism should be illuminated by Christianity. Shintoism, animism, and even agnosticism and atheism can become agnostic Christianity and atheist Christianity, because the reality that is Christ cannot be ignored, but it is not necessary for anybody to actually seize upon a religious practice, a cult, a ritual of any kind. The reality of Christ, which is what is so important, is far more than any religion. Now what is the question? If everything comes from God, what do we have of value that we can offer in return? And the answer obviously is, what we can give is ourselves, because we ourselves are the only things that we truly possess. Anything that we have in terms of riches, in terms of possessions, these can be lost and taken from us in an instant. I know I have lost 17 million euros in fraud. It's very easy. But what I have cannot be removed from me, and that is myself, and I have given myself to Christ, and I am starting to live a life unselfishly, trying to help others. We must do this in the utmost discretion. As Christ himself had said, let not the left hand know what the right hand is doing. But this is what I intend to do. We become part of the solution instead of part of the problem by bringing the contact with Christ, which is in itself miraculous healing, into the lives of those that our destiny, in other words, Christ, brings us into contact with. The fact that you have seen this, the fact that you have reached this far, is no accident. and I am at your disposal to help you in any way I can. I will not ask for anything for myself, but only that I help as much as I can. God bless.